This is Company Breakdowns from Turpentine, a deep dive on a compelling tech company's strengths, TAM, business model, and potential for market domination. I'm your host, Erik Torenberg, and on this season, I'll be joined by the smartest people in tech to record deep dives on companies like Reddit, Databricks, and more. Today, we're sharing something a little different, an episode of the Riff podcast with Byrne Hobart. Byrne is a writer with a following of over 50,000 subscribers, consisting of some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley. On the Riff, he talks through the analysis covered in his business, tech, and sociology essays. This episode covers Stripe's shift towards unbundling. If you'd like to get an hour with Byrne every week, head over to the Riff. Welcome to the Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in.
Cool. So last week we talked a lot about ISAs, we talked about education, and I thought that'd be a good segue into a piece you wrote this week about AI and education and the different ways in which it'll impact it. Why don't you unpack what you're trying to do in that piece?
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of discourse about AI, and I end up buying into both sides that ChatGPT, et cetera, it just creates this golden age for cheating, slacking, not doing the work. The cleanest piece of evidence for that is how quickly it destroyed Chegg's business model once there was an even faster way to get answers to arbitrary quiz questions. So yeah, I think a lot of that, it completely destroys the value prop of grading, where you do try to see if someone has mastered enough of the material that they can somewhere between regurgitate it and synthesize it and use it. And you use some kind of proof of work, an essay or a quiz or a test or whatever to determine that. I don't know that we will have that every public school in America will switch to some kind of system where you have to declaim your answers while standing in front of the class for 30 minutes and you get quizzed on algebra or the plot of Romeo and Juliet or whatever. We're probably not going to do that. It seems time consuming. So yeah, it is true that for someone who just wants to get the minimum possible grade and minimize the amount of effort/learning required to do that, AI is great for them. And I'm dubious on that being such a huge problem, because I don't think you can get very good retention if you're already trying to minimize your effort and just trying to get a good grade. If that's what you were doing, you're going to do it more efficiently. It will be harder for employers to distinguish between people who actually did the effort and people who didn't. But it's always been the case. And maybe it just reveals that a lot of the courses people were taking it was not something they were interested in, and also not something especially valuable to employers anyway. And so maybe there's some secret third reason that we go to school, if it's not to become well-rounded humanist scholars and Renaissance persons, or the other goal of just make sure you can get a job that allows you to buy stuff that impresses your peers and your parents. If we don't have those two reasons, I'm just really not sure why we are deferring 18-year-olds entry into the real world for a couple of years of who knows what. But so that's a kind of depressing piece, but it's not the only impact. So the other impact is if you actually care about topics and want to learn, you shouldn't be using solely AI tutors, but AI gives you this massive surface area. And when I think about ways that I've learned things I'm unfamiliar with, it's the most informative thing to do is have a conversation with a domain expert. But the problem is that those conversations, they turn up a lot of questions at very variable levels of kind of utility for that person to answer. And often when I talk to someone who's really deep into some topic that I have a superficial understanding of, I realize just how superficial my understanding was, and that the things that I thought were important are not really important. The rules of thumb that I had internalized have been obsolete for a decade plus, et cetera. And because LLMs have pretty comprehensive surface level knowledge of everything, they're just a really good way to do things like ask if there is a term for the phenomenon you've observed, or ask if there's a better source. Sometimes the sources are made up, but usually for the canonical source, which is the one that you want to read so you have a common frame of reference with the actual experts, there will be enough training data on that common source. And of course, if you find the term for the thing that you're trying to find the name of so you can study it, you can always default to the other trick of you Google that term plus best textbook plus Reddit or Metafilter or whatever your community of choice is, and you will probably find people recommending a textbook that gives you the actual fundamentals that you care about. So Yeah, I think for self-directed learners, it's pretty incredible. And I have my personal anecdote on this is just that I do use ChatGPT for that exact purpose of there's some area that I need to understand better. Let's surface a bunch of information about it. I will pick where in that surface to start drilling for more information, and then that becomes part of my process. And it's also really useful for just like there's this whole category of knowledge where it's not incredibly hard to have. It's not incredibly hard to acquire that knowledge, but you have to know what you're looking for, know what's out there. And this is often true for things like, is X a one-of-a-kind unique phenomenon, or is it just you've only been paying attention to something for a while, for a couple of months, and so the first time this regular occurrence happens, you want to find out, does this happen all the time? So this like it applies to market stuff where like every time the market goes down, there is someone for whom this is the first time they've ever owned stocks that all went down at the same time. They're really freaked out, and it could be useful for someone like that to find out that, yeah, this kind of thing does happen pretty regularly. It's probably not the end of the world. Always feels like it is the end of the world at the time. But it also shows up in political stuff. People like to use the term unprecedented. Often there is a precedent. You can sometimes find that precedent. So I think that's like maybe a good rule of thumb for using LLMs for research purposes is like anytime you hear something described as unprecedented, it's a really good idea to check with the chatbot of your choice and see if there is perhaps some precedent out there that you can learn from. My other example of not strictly AI-enabled education, but tech-enabled education in general is my oldest child is 8. She's in a school that has this basically app-focused curriculum where students spend 2 hours a day on academics. So at her level, it's math, reading, and language. And then the rest of the time on enrichment stuff, which is some of the usual school stuff, but I think often with a twist. So like instead of PE, they were learning karate for a while. They had a robotics class, they had an etiquette class that was also a history class. So it's a novel system, but what's striking to me about it is that kids can pace themselves, but they're all mostly learning through an app. There's still utility for teachers because kids can get stuck, and often when you get stuck, per the discussion earlier of just how do you learn stuff on your own, like talking to someone who knows the topic well, who can listen to you for a few seconds and really figure out, okay, here's the gap in your mental model of what you're doing, or here is something that is foundational knowledge you were supposed to have, but you don't quite have that down yet. So you need to practice this thing that you theoretically learned before until you actually know it. But it's like that approach is just significantly more efficient. So it's 2 hours a day instead of most of the day, and kids can pace themselves. So she's pacing ahead of grade level with less time. And I don't know that applies to everything. Like I think in general with education, like any kind of ed tech kind of thing or any kind of new school kind of thing, like it is almost always the case that the results look absolutely amazing for the first couple cohorts, and then as it gets deployed more widely, those results do tend to mean revert. And a lot of that is just selection effects. So if you talk to an ed tech startup and they tell you that they've enrolled kids and the kids are using this software and kids are 5 years ahead of grade level or whatever, and then you ask them where they got their kids, and it's like, well, I quit my job at a big tech company and asked all of my big tech coworkers who were parents if they'd want their kids to try this. And so, yeah, if you have this group that's selected where like the worst school that any of their parents went to was still just short of Ivy League, then the kids will probably do pretty well. The parents are clearly demonstrating some interest in education or probably pushing their kids outside of school, etc. So like lots of reasons to be skeptical of aggregate data on any kind of educational intervention that's opt-in, because the people who opt in are going to really distort things. And it's kind of expensive and somewhat controversial to do RCTs and just like see if this intervention actually helps people or does not by randomly enrolling some of them in it and depriving others of it. We should have more RCTs in education, but it's just really tough to get that pushed through. So like be skeptical of that as like a description of the average expected result. But part of what I care about with school is just making sure my kids aren't bored. And I think that keeping them at grade level, whether they are ahead or behind their same age peers, like being at grade level, being challenged enough that you're actually learning, not so challenged that you just fail and not just completely bored out of your mind because you understood the material the first time and this is the 10th time it's being explained in a different way. Like that seems like a big win to me. But on the economic side, if you do have a model where kids are interacting more with software and they're interacting just ad hoc with actual teachers, then you also have a model that can scale with improvements in that software. So it's just like if you are doing customer service for some product and you get one complaint about some feature, that's barely anything. But If half of the customer service questions you get are all about the same feature, then customer service is really in more of a product function. They really should be pushing for whatever this confusing thing is to get fixed. And once it gets fixed, you need fewer customer service people, and or you can have a much larger number of customers and can give them better service without having to expand the customer service team. So I think that's something exciting in education, because just by default in any kind of field where the main input is labor, the default expectation is that productivity in that field declines by default at roughly the pace of productivity growth everywhere else in the economy, because the rest of the economy is bidding for this talent, and if there's higher productivity elsewhere in the economy, the minimum bid keeps ratcheting up. So teachers do have to get paid better or they will stop teaching just year to year as wages generally rise. But if they are teaching the same way and teaching the same material that they were teaching decades earlier, then you won't see productivity growth in terms of outcomes. So you have higher cost and similar outcome. In practice, it's not necessarily similar. Sometimes it gets worse. Rarely does it get better. But that means, like, by default, everyone in education is on this relentless treadmill where the ROI keeps getting worse because it gets more expensive to provide the same thing. So you really want to find cases where you could actually have positive long-term productivity growth in education. Otherwise, it just gets really unsustainable. And like a lot of other cases where there's low productivity growth, but there is like this consensus we need to spend money on it, it just becomes really contentious because it is extremely easy to point to waste in the education system. It's extremely easy to point to many kinds of inefficiencies, like the stats that you would think would be really predictive, like average classroom size or average spending per pupil. Those do not actually have very meaningful predictive value. Like the highest spending school districts tend to have the worst results, in part because those are school districts where the city they're in has such a high cost of living that you have to really pay teachers a lot to make it sustainable for them to work there. And then a lot of the people who are paying property taxes, paying into that school system, they're still sending their kids to private schools. So you do end up, again, through selection effects, with this surprisingly inverted relationship between per pupil spending and educational outcomes. And then another case where it gets just really like politically toxic, pathological, whatever, is that since school budgets are like the money that get allocated is based on pupil count or based on number of days that students actually attend school in that district. So anytime that students bleed off from going to public school by default to private schools or homeschools or unschooling or pods or whatever, anytime that happens, the school's unit economics get the school does not have great unit economics for this. Like, they have a fixed cost, does not really go down if they lose a student, but their revenue does go down. So you will just tend to see this case where school districts, once they reach some tipping point, they just continuously decline in quality, and more parents try to keep their kids out. And then you have a set of people who work in that school district who they have a job and their skills may or may not transfer to other work, but they know that their job is threatened, and they also have more free time because there's just less work for them to do if the district is losing pupils. So they tend to, it's kind of the dark inverse, or maybe the happy inverse, depending on your view of these things, of the Airbnb and Uber strategy of go into a city where your product isn't legal yet and make sure by the time anyone is discussing whether or not it should be legal, there are a bunch of people who have their whole livelihood dependent on this staying legal or being confirmed as legal. Like, that worked really well for them as a growth strategy, was pretty aggressive. I don't know that this was the original Airbnb plan, but it certainly was the direction they ended up kind of evolving into. And you'll see the same thing with education. So my guess is, like, it will get more contentious. There may be places where homeschooling, like the freedom to homeschool, gets rolled back a bit, or where private schools get some level of scrutiny. But really, like, we can look at this aggregate system and say it's not producing exceptional results. It is really expensive. Something's got to change. We don't entirely know what that is, but there are clearly technologies that can be applied to making this process better, and those will probably be disproportionately beneficial to the best students. But that is something that really matters. Like, people who are really, really smart and invent new things create positive externalities for the rest of the world. If you want the median student to feel better right now, you should probably get rid of gifted and talented classes and reduce the number of AP classes. They will feel relatively better. But if you want them to have a better life 30 years from now, you probably want as much of that tracking as possible. You want students just tearing through school if they are actually capable of it, so that they can spend more of their time doing productive work that eventually spills over into higher GDP, better stuff for everybody.
There's a line of thinking that says, hey, the best way to educate people is one-on-one tutoring. We have this factory model in education. AI will enable tutoring at scale, kind of in ways that you indicate, not only for self-driven learners, but ideally through the K through 12 system. Do you think that because of the scleroticism of the system, that 15 years from now, let's say that K through 12 will kind of look pretty similar to how it does today in terms of format wise? And a two-part question, which is, what do you think you'll do with your kids and schooling? Will they be in a traditional school? Will they be in homeschool? Will they go to college? How do you think about this?
Yeah, I kind of try to re-underwrite that decision every year for every kid. Right now, it's one. So yeah, our oldest is in this local school, Alpha School. It's going really well for her. We're enrolling the next one in Alpha, and then pretty much kid by kid, we'll decide, like, does this child seem like they would thrive if part of their day is get on their computer, put on their headphones, and crank through a bunch of arithmetic drills and read some short pieces and answer quiz questions? Like, will they thrive in that? Do they need something else? I think homeschooling is going to significantly improve due to the availability of AI. That, like, one of the drawbacks to homeschooling is that not every adult remembers every detail of a standard high school curriculum. The stuff is not incredibly hard to learn. Like, median high school student can pass high school. So clearly most of us were capable of this at some point, but there is a big time investment, and being able to quickly remind yourself of things like, okay, what is the long division algorithm? Like, you're probably not going to use that after you learn long division. You will probably learn how it works and then switch to using a calculator and never do that again. But yeah, it's good to remember how it works, and it's good to remember what the rules are. What is the subjunctive? Can you split an infinitive, or why not? What's an example? Actually, coming up with quizzes is also something that LLMs can do very, very quickly, and that's extremely convenient. Like, if you can just give it a 1,000-word short story and say, please give me 5 quiz questions that someone could answer to indicate that they actually read the story. It's a lot easier to just do that through an app than to think of it yourself. So I think it reduces the friction for homeschooling. But I don't know that parents are just not necessarily going to push their kids at the right pace, and they're also just economies of scale. The one-on-one tutoring thing does make a lot of sense if you can afford a full-time tutor, and that's a direction that I would definitely consider going in. And I think you can kind of potentially titrate that over time, where you hire a part-time tutor for the thing that they're really interested in and really excelling in, and otherwise they're doing a more normal school track. So I think, yeah, you can kind of mix and match, but homeschool, there are many good reasons to do it, but there are also many logistical challenges, and so it becomes something where it's less. I think I have less of like a policy view and more of a default view, and more of an openness to many different models of managing a family's time and figuring out the best way to educate their kids.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
Another thing we also talked about last week was Meta and AI, and you follow up this week as well. Why don't you unpack what you were saying there?
Yeah, so I continue to just be really interested in what Meta is up to and what they're thinking in AI. They had the release of the very impressive Llama 3 models and all of the stuff that they've been doing there. And I think one of the interesting things about just the Llama situation was kind of how path dependent it was, that they were buying lots of GPUs in order to have better targeting for Reels, and then they use those GPUs to train a model. But where I think there's an interesting question about whether you end up, when you're on Meta, like, do they want you interacting more with AI, mostly with AI, almost entirely with AI? Like, it is a way to make sure that the feed always has something that you personally would want to read in it. On the other hand, is that really what anyone signed up for? Like, if the idea of the app is to improve personal connections, but you're actually interacting with this sort of sanitized, ghostly avatar of the people, maybe that's a worse experience. But the other way to flip this around is to say that in a world where it's possible to create human level text very, very cheaply without actually hiring humans to do it, then being able to sort that text and identify what was actually produced by humans and what was just produced by a robot does actually become valuable if what's being sold is that human connection. So I think it's still an open question as to how that evolution will go, as to what Meta really wants from this and where they would monetize it.
Relatedly, you also talked about how Meta and TikTok are paying people to post and browse. Why is that interesting?
Yeah, so I think I have this model of media where you have, like, if you are producing media and you're transmitting it digitally, your marginal cost of showing the same thing to one more person is close to zero. It does matter at scale, but you can round it down to zero for most purposes, which means that for any given piece of content, you can always ask yourself, like, is this something I sell to people, or is this something I use as an ad to get people to look at my stuff? But then you can extend that further. You could actually say, well, if the price could be either zero or a positive number, why not a negative number? Like, will there be people for whom it is just worth reaching them with this content, even if you have to pay them to consume it? And I think with Meta, what they were doing was they were paying people to specifically post like positive, upbeat things to threads. And I think they are just trying to engineer threads to be like same product, like same set of features as Twitter, but with inverted pathologies. So Meta is just going to be too nice, too friendly, too upbeat, too peppy, and then Twitter is going to be still kind of mean, like generally cruel. Things like the quote retweet feature is basically engineered to promote human cruelty. Like it is a way to poke fun at somebody else. You can use it to riff on what somebody else said. You can use it to yes and them, and that's nice. But that's not the way most people do that. So yeah, I think Meta's just trying to engineer a more pleasant environment, and we'll see if people actually like that, or if they decide that this is just too fake and weird, and that Twitter is the gritty reboot of the chronologically newer but kind of like culturally older norm of just we're all going to be really nice to each other and then we'll all get along. And then on TikTok, like they were paying people to just browse TikTok in the EU. The EU made them stop, or at least complained about it. I think they decided to stop. And I think the idea there was just you need training data. The TikTok model has been that you pay for a bunch of users and then you use those users to get enough training data to figure out what the next round of paying users will get. And eventually you get to the point where you can actually have decent unit economics and get enough retention that you make more money showing these people ads than you spent on ads to get those people. But paying people to just browse TikTok for a while is a way to bootstrap some of that initial training data and just figure out what is different about this market and how can we start segmenting people and showing them the stuff they want to see. I do want to go back to, by the way, the earlier question on Facebook and AI, because they reported earnings last week. Market reaction was not positive. Stock went down, but they almost, on the call, they almost sounded like they were bored having this discussion with Wall Street, which was that periodically Meta spends a lot of money on something that usually works out, doesn't necessarily always work out, doesn't always work out to the magnitude that they'd like to, but usually when Meta spends a bunch of money, it is on something that investors are retrospectively glad they spent money on. But one of the problems is, like, as the business gets more mature, they're spending money on infrastructure. They have a very large CapEx budget. They raised their CapEx expectations for this year, but they also spend money in terms of opportunity costs. So when they were doing Reels and just trying to get share in short video, they knew that Reels would monetize worse than the rest of the feed content for a while. And so they were accepting this multi-billion-dollar headwind to revenue. But if you're running the numbers, you're looking at a financial model, what is cash flowing out of the business? That keeps going up. Like, their costs keep going up in cash terms, and that will eventually lead to higher accounting costs and higher costs in GAAP terms because you're depreciating that stuff pretty fast. And then revenue is slowing down because they're also trying to service some of their more AI forward stuff so that they can get the training data so that the next round of AI features will look better. So for a while, you have both lines moving in the exact wrong direction, and it looks like the business is resetting towards slower growth and lower margins, and that means it deserves a lower multiple. So, like, everything is pointing to the stock is going down. But that is just how it has to work for them to get enough data to do the next thing that they want to do. And then on the cost side, they need to actually do something with that data, and it turns out that tends to require just a lot of flops compared to what it used to.
Quick side note on Meta. What is the right way of, a year later, almost 2 years later, what's the right way of thinking about their metaverse big bet? Like what is the mental model for thinking about that?
So I think I don't I think it has gone much worse than they thought, but I also think that when they talked about this, they did the whole pivot, they changed the company's name to Meta. They didn't seem to be saying that the metaverse is what we'll all move to next year. It was like, this is where people will go eventually. We don't know exactly when. We think that we can accelerate the process by which people move their interactions into the metaverse, and that we can also own more of that as it happens. And I don't know. It's like I was never completely sold on the metaverse thing, but I also felt like I'm sure they have people who know a lot more about product than I do and about how to digitize social interactions than I do. And maybe I'm too old. Maybe the next generation is like the generation that spent a lot more time than I did in Roblox and Fortnite and the like is going to be used to this idea of interacting with friends by signing onto some system where you have a 3D avatar, and so do they, and that's how you hang out. So like I'm kind of I would be agnostic, except that it's costing them a lot of money, and it's just really hard to be agnostic about a company spending billions of dollars into something that doesn't appear to be producing high returns. But I like the instinct that they know that there are these platform shifts. They don't want to miss a platform shift, and the fact that they did mobile really really well eventually, but they also recognize that they left just a lot of money on the table by not being early enough to mobile that they actually control the operating systems in the stores. So they recognize that that's an existential risk. And so I think it's sort of like you do want to treat, I think you want to treat the metaverse as like likely malinvestment, but in the category of, if the company weren't making investments like that from time to time, then they would eventually go to zero. And if the investments that they make in whatever they think the next platform is, or these big, bold infrastructure type bets, if they do that and you say that's obvious right now, then it was probably the wrong move. Like, probably other people are doing that and are ahead of Meta. So you want them to be doing things that look dumb to you from time to time. That's really the only way that they can be credibly good at their jobs.
Yeah. And following up even further, going back to Meta and AI, what does their AI strategy mean for OpenAI and Anthropic in terms of, or other sort of players? What do you think about that?
Yeah, like it seems like a meaningful threat that if it is the case that, like, at any given time there's probably a closed proprietary model that you have to pay to access, and that's the best model. But the second best model, or there is a good enough model that you can run on your own hardware that is free to use for almost anyone. It's usually like free to use unless you are large enough to be one of Meta's direct competitors in AI, and then you can't. I think that something like that scenario, it's okay for someone like OpenAI and Anthropic if they are continuously able to launch newer and better models. We'll see if the rumors that GPT either 4.5 or 5 exists and has been secretly tested under the GP2 monitor for a while. Like, we'll see if that pans out. But I think, like, every time for a while, it was the case that these language models kept improving, and so it kept getting closer to, okay, this almost sounds like a human being wrote it. Like, it's less of a fever dream and more just like grammatically coherent but nonsensical content. And then we did reach this point where, no, it's actually grammatically coherent and it makes sense, and the AI can hold a thought in its head for long enough to write an essay to help you get an A in an English class when you did the reading or whatever. But there is just always this question of, do they run into some kind of barrier, either just a theoretical barrier of, we trained it on a bunch of content produced by humans, and so it is as smart as those humans but not smarter, or some barrier like, yeah, we can keep training it on synthetic data, it will keep improving, but there is some super linear cost function there where you eventually get to the point where it's like, even though you see a path towards a smarter model, you don't see a path towards a smarter model that pays. And at that point, if the open source pattern keeps holding, then there's like this brief period where OpenAI or Anthropic is still measurably the best, and then there's convergence between the proprietary models and the free models. And then it becomes a question of distribution. Meta does have pretty incredible distribution, but again, they have very expensive distribution in the sense that anytime they give you a call to action on the Facebook newsfeed or on Instagram that says, hey, interact with our AI model, like they are spending hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in foregone ad revenue. And then, of course, they're spending the cost of inference if you actually do use the model. So I think at that point, it like the quality, like if either model quality just hits some kind of theoretical asymptote or hits some kind of practical asymptote, then the advantage that someone like AI or Anthropic has is that they do have distribution into particular areas. And I think in that case, you probably do want to bet on OpenAI, where the bet is, okay, they become the default enterprise tool, and they sell to everybody through Microsoft. They get tightly integrated with Microsoft products. Maybe eventually there is some kind of convergence between the OpenAI company and Microsoft, because it is kind of untenable to have a business where you basically have one customer and they are your lifeline, and also that customer has its own AI research group and is trying to do the things that you do. Like that becomes very strategically tricky. But Sam Altman is smart. He's been able to maneuver around complex corporate politics before and has come out ahead. So yeah, it's sort of like what you basically want to think about is like there is probably this very short space between the headline that makes you think, okay, OpenAI is dead, and the headline of, hey, Sam Altman is now the CEO of Microsoft. Like, how'd that happen?
Yeah, exactly. That's funny. Is iPhone Android a right analogy here, or what's a good historical analogy to think about sort of what Meta is doing relative to the other players?
And it's tough because AI is one of the, in some domains it's sufficiently transformative that you have to go really, really far back to find relevant models. If you're looking for transformative information technology, stuff like the written word, the printing press, etc., kind of comes into play as the relevant analogy, where it isn't just changing how you transmit information, it does change how you think, it changes how you work, and leads to all sorts of complicated nth order consequences that we can't quite model today. I would say like the Android versus Google thing it's a useful starting point, Android versus Apple thing. It's a useful starting point, especially in the sense that Android is less open than you would think from the description of it's an open source mobile operating system. Like, yes, it is that, but a lot of the stuff that makes it useful is proprietary to Google. And so Google does have some commercial leverage there, and they certainly exercise it, but they have a lot of different angles. Like Google, ultimately, it is very hard for Google to make more money doing something other than having an additional, very convenient search bar that is leading to additional search queries, getting them more data, getting them data in more context. Like, it's hard for anything to beat the economics of that. And AI, it may have, I guess that becomes that question starts to hinge on how important is synthetic data versus how important is the quantity of data produced by actual humans. Now, if it is the case that synthetic data runs into its own limitations and that you just really need something that comes out of a human mind to give the AI more capabilities, then probably the system that is like open enough to have a large surface area, but closed enough that they still have access to all of the inputs and all the outputs and the ratings or other kinds of user feedback that can emerge from that. Like that is probably the winning formula, that like once we've exhausted all of the openly available sources of data, once everything is licensed exclusively to one AI company or another, then it starts to become a question of how can you get this continuous inflow of data that you can use for training purposes. And in that case, like Llama, because it's open source, anyone who is just running Llama either has a lower cost way to run Llama in the cloud, or is willing to accept lower gross margins, perhaps because they're venture funded and they have just kind of elided some of the details of their unit economics when talking to investors about where their massive growth rate came from. Like whatever the reason is, like it's very hard for Meta to be the main place where people are interacting with all the Llama models if they are truly open, in which case you are back to saying the proprietary side wins, not because the proprietary models perform better necessarily, but because they have a tighter loop for actually collecting more user data that trains the next generation of models. But that gets tricky in its own way. Like Microsoft's customers do not want OpenAI training the next generation of LLMs on all of their internal memos. That could have all sorts of bad consequences, and it's their data, and they do actually have lawyers who try to figure out who has access to what and make sure that they're not accidentally leaking something really valuable outside their organization. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, unfortunately. I wish there were a really clean answer. I wish there were one company that was the obvious winner and they had a stock ticker and you could just buy that one and forget about it for a while.
NVIDIA.
No. Well, yeah, NVIDIA. Well, I mean, there was. So when Zuckerberg gave his interview with Dorkesh a few weeks ago, he did casually mention that it's a little bit easier than it used to be to get a GPU, and a lot of stocks did seem to react to that one in the next day or two.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also want to return back to something we were talking about earlier around ads or around Meta and TikTok paying people to post. There was this idea a while ago that eventually companies like Uber, it would be free to use as a customer, but we would just have to watch or listen to ads the whole time. And it feels like that paradigm, as ad tech gets better, would be favorable for a lot of customers who don't want to pay for stuff and would pretend to listen or watch ads. Do you see that as a viable future?
I think it's going to be pretty hard to have a case where there is a free service that requires, like there's a service that requires human labor and expensive capital, and it's free at the point of use because people are being shown ads for some other service that they will have to actually spend money on. So like basically for Uber as an purely ad supported business to be viable in the long run, you have to be spending significantly more on the companies whose ads you saw in your Uber than you did on Uber itself. Otherwise, they'd just charge you for the Uber. And that seems unlikely. Like, how compelling are these ads? Why aren't these ads just being shown on YouTube videos or TikToks or something if they're that good? And yeah, you're right. If you literally pay people to just sit there and watch ads, the people who will do that are people who don't have many other economic prospects and thus are probably not going to buy very much. It's also just kind of a weird pitch. But the thing that does work is if you have a business that is okay, reasonably profitable, and it does involve having captive attention of someone about whom you have some data, then adding ads to that business can be the difference between a profit and a loss. But it's never like just an ad business, and it's almost never monetizing purely through ads. It's usually monetizing a bunch of different things, and then ads are this extra high margin piece. I think the two examples that probably fit there the best would be one, the obvious Amazon, the retail operation, where an increasing share of their revenue comes from ads, and the ads are just a way to ask the merchants on Amazon, like, what is your contribution margin per customer? Okay, give us that, and then you will get the customer. Or give us 90% of that, and you get the last 10%, and you get the customer. And if you don't want to do that, somebody else will be willing to take that bargain, and you won't be able to sell any merchandise. So that has worked pretty well for Amazon. It has created this sort of free market price discrimination system where they are charging everyone whatever the maximum cut they could get away with is. And then the less obvious example is the grocery business, where there have been, so grocery companies, I don't think they usually break this out, but there is this whole slotting fee thing where consumer packaged goods companies will pay for prominent placement inside of a store. And in groceries, you always have a set of products that people are going to show up to buy, where they're very price sensitive. And so you make the pricing on those products pretty prominent, and then you arrange your store so that someone who is walking to those products is also walking past a bunch of higher margin stuff. That's not the only reason that things are set up that way. Like milk and eggs, they're at the far end of the store in part because they have to be refrigerated, and so you don't want your refrigeration thing like in the middle of the store. It's very inconvenient. If you have it up against the wall, it's a lot easier. It's also a lot easier to restock those shelves if they are facing if there's like the storage area right behind them, so you can just slide stuff in without sending someone out into the store. So there are other reasons that it works that way. But if you look at the economics of someone like a Kroger, there is a sense in which they actually, after all of their other costs, they break even to lose money just selling food and other stuff. And then the actual margin, the actual positive profit margin they get comes from those slotting fees. Now that situation does evolve over time. The impression I get is that the slotting fees, they have pulled back a little bit, at least there's less growth there. But then if you look at someone like Instacart, like that's a model where slotting fees can be this really, really powerful tool because you have infinite shelf space. You have a lot of first party data on the user. You can you can show them different offerings depending on every incremental action they take. So if they search for a product but they didn't buy it, well, then you know that retargeting them with that product is much more likely to lead to a purchase than someone who's never expressed interest in the product. So there are a lot of ways to increase the ad load there, but still most of the money that they get is charging a fee for someone purchasing the groceries and trying to make the money back on ads and membership and other stuff like that. Instead of you're probably not going to get to a point where you're like browsing Instacart, everything is free, but it's all ad supported. Like at some point, someone has to actually buy stuff for the ads to be worth running. And so you always have to remember that there is like ads are not this perpetual money machine. Like they exist because they sell products, and when they don't sell products, they don't exist.
Yeah, there was this joke. This guy Soren Iverson has this sort of Twitter account where he posts images of fake products and one fake features, and one fake feature was that there was an ad lottery where one person had to watch like 20,000 ads straight on YouTube so that everyone else could watch with no ads. He was subsidizing the market. Yeah.
No, it's could be interesting. I guess you could imagine a case where there's an ad supported product that is completely free, but in that case the ads would be propaganda. Like that is the time where you actually want to convince someone of something and they don't need to make a purchase. So like it's actually this nightmarish vision of the future. Like if you could ride Uber for free and you were not spending more money on the products you bought because of the ads you saw on Uber, then you are just being hypnotized by whoever is the high bidder for those few minutes of your attention. Yeah,
that's pretty funny. It's actually interesting. Side note, I got in touch with this business Beehive that's like a Substack competitor, and we're partnered with them at Turpentine. And I feel like I underestimated them as a business because they're not just trying to compete with Substack, they're trying to compete with MailChimp. And they because they worked at Morning Brew, they know how to optimize email engagement, and they're providing that as a service. And so anyone who's trying to get better conversion rates on email is a potential customer, but they're also trying to introduce an ad market on top of emails. And right now that doesn't really exist.
So the Diff has the spinoff newsletter Capital Gains.
Great.
Capital Gains is on Beehive, and we do actually use that ad system both on the both buying ads and selling them. And it seems to work pretty well. It's been interesting to me that people haven't built really great email newsletter ad networks yet. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think part of it is that when newsletters are popular, a lot of people are joining the industry, a lot of people are starting them, but the attrition rate is really high, and there's also just a lot of competition for attention. So maybe the time when it looks like a really good time to build a tool like that is actually a time when you're going to have a lot of cases where your advertiser bought an ad and the person who sold in that ad never actually ran the ad, and they're frustrated. Even if they didn't pay for it, like they were hoping to run a campaign on a particular date, it didn't happen. They're frustrated. So like it is probably a tough business where like part of what makes the newsletter ecosystem great is that if someone has a newsletter that only 50 people will read, they can find those 50 people and those people will read it, and it could still be a gratifying thing to do, even if it's not really a business. But that same fragmentation also means that it's just really tough to do $1 million ad buy in the newsletter space. You're having a lot of negotiations with a lot of people, many of whom are very picky about what kind of ad shows up where, because the newsletter is a representation of them. Like the reply to email is their personal email address. So like people tend to be more sensitive about that. Whereas I'm sure someone at the New York Times objects to some of the ads the New York Times runs, but it's not like you feel like it's a personal reflection on you if you happen to write for a publication that happens to run an ad that you think is in poor taste or for a product that shouldn't exist or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. I stupidly passed on Beehive early on, and now I have the sort of emotional complex of not wanting to invest at Series A or Series B because I have too much pride, even though it's still perhaps likely to be at least 10x, but not 100x. Very common VC investor trap.
Yeah, 10x is tolerable.
Yes, exactly.
It's a living.
Yes, totally. Okay, before we get out of here, there's a couple more things I want to get to. One is your piece on free puts as having an expiration date. What do you get?
Yeah. So a lot of investors are and will say that they are on the quest for some kind of asymmetric opportunity where you can make a lot, you won't lose a lot. And those can be really great. And I like those too. And you can often in public markets, you can just structure your bet that way, where if you think that a stock might double, but it might also go to zero, well, call options that are struck at the current price or struck above the current price, like those are the right way to say, like, I don't want all the exposure to going to zero. I just want the exposure to the upside. And then, of course, you're paying the market price for that. So it's not just, you can't just say, I think there's a binary outcome here. It's either really bad or really good, and therefore I'm going to be clever and buy call options. Like, the person selling you those options also probably knows that it's a binary outcome. So like if you're, I don't know, betting on options for a company that is at phase 3 of its FDA approvals, like probably those options prices reflect the fact that there's not like halfway approved. There's either a really good outcome or they're back to the drawing board on that particular product. So people like those, and sometimes they find them in cases where there is some kind of government backstop for an industry or government backstop for a market. So for a while, the kind of lazy but sophisticated strategy in U.S. equity markets was lever up and buy the S&P and buy 10-year treasuries. And the thinking was that when stocks go down, it's because growth expectations are worse. And there's a feedback loop where when the market crashes, people tend to get a little more cautious about spending and companies get more cautious about hiring. So, but if stocks go down, and that does impact expected future growth for the overall economy, then the Fed will cut rates. And that was actually true for a long time. Like in the post-crisis period, people did very, very well just doing that. And a lot of that was that stocks did well, but also the bonds did fine and were just a really good hedge in those brief periods where stocks did not do well. But that strategy only makes sense if the Fed is only changing rates in response to growth. And that only happens when inflation is very low and very stable, which was the case from really, I basically date this back to 1998. That is, if you look at the correlation between stocks and treasury bonds, that is about when the inverse correlation really locked in. And it was because there was this financial crisis, mostly East Asian countries, but also it had this ripple effect where long-term capital management ended up on the wrong side of some trades and unwound very, very fast and threatened the financial system. But they escaped, and the Fed also cut rates substantially in that brief and scary summer crisis period. So what people started to realize was, yeah, if things get really, really bad, rates go down, and therefore stocks go back up. And so you can feel pretty comfortable that if you own stocks, the Fed's got your back. But that was also like the reason that whole East Asia crisis was happening was that you had these balance of payments issues where Japan had industrialized earlier than other countries in that area. They had this wonderful export-driven model, and then that model or variations of it got adopted by other countries. And you started to run into this problem as China started to grow their exports, was that there's actually a lot of competition at the lower end of product quality, and that China had an effectively infinite labor supply. But as long as China was continuing to add workers, build factories, build ports and railroads and things like that, you could basically be pretty confident that inflation in consumer durables would be minimal for the foreseeable future. And this was just the right bet to make over like a 10 to, I guess, like a 20-year period where China was consistently making things cheaper, so inflation was just not a problem. But then the Chinese working age population peaked and started to decline. For a while, they were able to offset that with higher investment. But eventually, it just got to the point where there was no longer this infinite labor supply. There was no longer this buffer where inflation would just not have a huge impact. So in higher inflation times, you can't just make this blind bet that if stocks are doing badly, bonds will go up. When inflation goes up, those asset classes both tend to underperform. So that was a case where there was this free put for a while, and then it went away. And the reason I was writing about the free put concept was that there was this Wall Street Journal article about the Chinese property market where the journal claimed that the big investment thesis was just the Chinese government knows that people put a lot of their savings into housing, that people get very mad if housing prices go down, therefore housing prices won't go down, therefore you can build as much housing as you want and somebody out there will buy it. But it did turn out that after a while, the government started to realize, like, hey, our entire economy is basically housing, etc. And that's not exactly socialism. That's not socialism with anybody's characteristics. That's just America circa 2006 with Chinese characteristics. So they did realize that's just not going to work, and kind of gave the corporate death penalty to a couple of the large property speculators, and kind of tried to freeze things for a while. And when you have a debt-fueled boom with this big overhang, there are a bunch of debts that can't be serviced. One of the ways to escape that, which is actually an approach that China used after 1998 because their banking system was insolvent, one of the approaches is just if you freeze that stuff for a while, and then grow the rest of the economy. Eventually, the debt as a share of the rest of the economy is lower, but the economy has to have some reason that it can actually grow. And for a while, China's economy could grow because of export-driven growth, because as Japan and Korea and Taiwan were getting richer, they were getting priced out of a lot of textile manufacturing, electronics assembly, etc. That stuff could go to China, and China was not priced out of that for a long time, and still seems quite competitive. But they are quite competitive in a more expensive environment, and so yeah, it's unclear to me where China goes from here. I've always felt like their put option is that GDP growth is not the only source of legitimacy that the CCP has, that they can also just make it impossible to protest, and then there's a different legitimacy calculation, but that's also just a really expensive transition to make. And even if people can't vocally complain that when their parents were growing up, the country was getting 8 to 10% richer every year, and now they're growing up and the country is getting 1% poorer every year. Like, even if they can't say that on WeChat and can't post about it on Weibo, like they're still thinking it. So it's probably not the government's first choice, but they do need to find some model where they reset expectations, where people don't think that property appreciates indefinitely, where people do want to save money in something other than just residential real estate. And that's going to take some creativity.
Yeah. Speaking of China, I want to segue to something else you wrote about, which was unbundling. You wrote about both the context of Stripe and then also in the context of ByteDance. So why don't you get that?
Yeah, so the Stripe one was that Stripe announced, like the older Stripe model was, hey, we're going to get payments right, and then we will sell you other things that make payments better, that make sense in the context of payments. And there's just a lot of lucrative things that are adjacent to getting money for your business from the things that you do for customers. So there is a lot of adjacency there. And so I think like the older model, I think, was we do like that bottom of the stack, just someone can enter their credit card number and their name and their address, etc., and then they can send you money. And then you build all of these other services on top of that stack, but they all assume that bottom layer is there. And then they did announce that they're shifting away from that now they will sell these tools independently of pure payments. And I think that is partly just a concession that the way that payments seem to work is that you have just a lot of different connections between different nodes in a network that you can make, and that there are once you do one of those connections pretty well, you will have customers who all tell you what the next thing to do is. And this has been the case for Stripe for a really long time, that the complaints are always, can you do this in this country, or can you support this payment method? Like that is a very common feature request. But if you start anywhere, then you're always growing adjacent to that thing. And if someone else starts somewhere else, either geographically or just a different purchase use case, then they have a different set of adjacent things they expand into. And since everyone is also building their anti-fraud models and their retry payment models based on the data that they have, everyone has a different data moat. So you can kind of imagine it as like if there's a petri dish and you seed different parts of it with different microbes, that they will all grow. And there may be a case where one of them can just outgrow the other one and swallow it whole, but it's also probably the case that they each grow into their own little territory, and then you end up with these different territories that have been divided, and they don't shift all that much. So at that point, it does make more sense to say, okay, whatever your foundation level way of getting money from your customers is, we can build things on top of that are useful to you, that help you make better business decisions. And yeah, eventually perhaps you'll switch your payments over, but payments, there is this ongoing debate over, are payments, is it a good business to be in payments? And I think that it's a tough debate to resolve, because people mean so many different things by payments, and also where the value actually accrues changes over time. And so it is like, payments in the aggregate are going to be very socially valuable. The question of, is there somewhere in that complicated stack where you can have venture scale returns and can continuously deploy capital at a good return on investment, the way that public investors want you to do? That question is a harder question with different answers, but it does look like the Stripe answer at this point is that these value added software services that are adjacent to payments, that are typically ingesting payments data and then either giving you business insights or making it more likely that you can accept payments, or helping you increment your revenue in other ways, like that is actually where more of the value resides. And I think that is perhaps a good thing. Like the reason Stripe existed and the reason that Adyen existed, the reason PayPal existed, is that payments are just a mess. Like we start with a system of, we exchange seashells, or we like this thing that looks like this piece of metal that looks roughly like the skin of a cow is worth one cow, and it's easier to transfer than a cow. And we build layers and layers and layers on top of that, and then we try to get these layers to be compatible with one another. But if you have like a US system where it was gold backed for a while and has these echoes of the implicit assumption of precious metal backing, and then you have like a Japanese system where it was originally pegged to a certain amount of rice, and you try to make these systems compatible, like they do have different underlying assumptions. They all have different evolutionary paths that they followed. So it's very tough to create some kind of global standard where all these systems can talk to one another. But if that problem is much more solved than it used to be, then it will become a lower margin thing to do, and you do have to find the next thing to do on top of that. And fortunately, again, like everything a business does is in some sense adjacent to money. So there's a lot of things you can do next if you've gotten that done.
Is it worth quickly getting into the 24-hour markets piece?
Yeah, sure. So 24-hour markets, New York Stock Exchange has been asking institutions if they would be interested in that. And it's weird that they're asking because at the same time that they're proposing that, volume has gotten increasingly concentrated at the open and the close. And it makes sense that volume would be concentrated at predictable times. Like, that is, a market in general is supposed to be just a predictable time and place where you can trade. So in pre long distance communication, you did have to figure out, okay, which buttonwood tree are we meeting under? Let's all meet under that buttonwood tree at a particular time each day, and we'll trade stuff. But the other reason that trading is particularly concentrated at the open and at the close is that if you are trading and you have some differentiated view, you want to do as much volume as you can and have the minimum market impact that you can. But also, you want to be trading at a time of high volume, and then market makers also want to be trading at a time of high volume. There's simply more business to do. And they also know that if that's the high volume time, that's also the time when people who don't have a very differentiated view are going to be trading actively, because they know that that's when they can put in a large order and expect it to get filled at a fairly predictable price. So it's actually in everyone's interest. Like, it's in the interest of the index rebalancers. It's in the interest of the discretionary hedge funds. It's in the interest of the quant systematic funds. Everyone wants to just trade at the times when everyone else is trading, because those are the times when you have the least market impact, whether you have an edge and are trying to get as large a position as possible because you think that whatever news comes out at 4:01 p.m. is going to be really good for your position, or you just need a large position because you're an index fund and you're required to own X amount of IBM and you don't own X amount, so you got to buy until you hit X. So adding more market hours probably doesn't significantly affect that. Like, people who are trading at weird times, you have a couple use cases, one of which is just you're gambling and it's a fun way to gamble. One of which is there is some overseas news that affects the stock price of something in the US and you want to be the first to react to that. But if market makers know that, they know that they should actually quote a fairly wide spread, because the only people trading with them will be fairly well-informed traders and gamblers. And so you basically want to quote a spread that is wide enough that the well-informed traders are scared off, and then potentially narrow enough that the gamblers are still willing to gamble, but they seem to just be willing to gamble regardless. So maybe they matter less. And it's really that balance of noise trader versus informed trader mediated by the market maker that determines whether or not trades happen, whether or not liquidity exists. I guess I could see a case where, especially if like the US, it does seem to be ahead in terms of lots of systematic investing, lots of ETFs, just a lot of capital markets infrastructure. Like, if the rest of the world is catching up with that, then the rest of the world will have more cases where the natural way to hedge something is to trade a US listed stock. But if they're in Japan, market hours don't really overlap, and so there isn't something to trade. So they basically have risk on the books that they need to trade at the open. That's another reason that the open is so lively. Like, the open and close are lively because that's when you have the best opportunity to hedge whatever thing has drifted out of being fully hedged since the last time there was a lot of liquidity. So yeah, I don't think it ends up being an especially big deal, but I also don't think it's a huge problem. Like, there are just lots of ways to gamble. And if we add one more way that does indirectly subsidize price discovery, like, the Robinhood traders are not making the market more efficient when they buy GameStop or AMC or whatever, but they are basically handing money to firms that do make the market more efficient. They are making it so that market makers can afford to quote a narrower spread. And that means that hedge funds can also transact at larger scale. So it is, of all the ways to waste your money betting on things that are outside of your control, that is the one that probably does have the most net pro-social benefit that you can actually trace to your behavior, but there's still a lot of frictional costs, and then you have to weigh that against, like, the more gambling you do in the market, the more the smartest people will opt into providing liquidity provision as their job, their craft, what they spend their life doing. And maybe we could always have a little more liquidity provision, but maybe we've got realistically enough.
Yeah, there's a couple more follow-ups I wanted to get to, one around open closed platforms, but I'll start with them next week. We're at time. This has been a great conversation, Byrne, as always. Until next week.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks for listening to Company Breakdowns. Make sure you're subscribed on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. Let us know in the comments or reviews what companies you want us to deep dive on next. Company Breakdowns is a show from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, Turpentine VC, Turpentine Finance, and Request for Startups.